Good afternoon. We are really excited to have this webinar today, and it's a joint SMI HIRC webinar about becoming more resilient. And we're glad you joined us today. We have a lot of information to share and pass along, and we have some really great speakers today. So we're going to be talking about how providers and suppliers can measure, improve, and collaborate for greater resiliency. We'll also be taking questions in the chat. So if you look in the chat, you'll see not only a link or you can submit your questions there, but there'll be a link for the survey. So please give us feedback at the end of this webinar, and we would love to hear from you. So we'll get started here. Welcome. Next slide. So we have some great speakers. I'm hosting. I'll be starting and ending. I'm Tom Herview. I'm the Chief Supply Chain Officer for BJC Healthcare. I'm also a HIRC board member, the chair-elect, and also an SMI member. We have Amanda Chawla, who is the Chief Supply Chain Officer for Stanford Health, HIRC member, and leads the SMI Resiliency and Transparency Council as co-chair. We have Alan Mavis with Baxter. He's also a HIRC board member, and he also co-leads the SMI Resiliency and Transparency co-chair, council co-chair. We have Nancy Anderson from SMI and Jesse Schaefer from HIRC. Great group of people. They're going to cover a lot of great information. We're excited to have such a talented group of people running the webinar for us today. Next slide, please. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to go back, and we're going to cover. We've done the introduction. We're going to talk a little bit about the HIRC and an SMI partnership and why it's important and why it's different in the industry. We're going to talk about some of the tools that SMI is built around resiliency, and then we're going to hit the tools that HIRC is built around resiliency. Very complementary, gives us a full spectrum of tools and services to look at the entire market and yourself and suppliers and partners as well. And then we're going to talk about where we go from there. So a lot of exciting information. We're going to get through as much as we can. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. But if we don't, please put your questions in the chat, and we will certainly close out throughout the chat to get that feedback to everyone. Next slide, please. So who is SMI? SMI provides a nexus of healthcare to drive meaningful improvements in supply chain agility, efficiency, and resiliency, enhancing patient care. And then we say, who is HIRC? HIRC is a nonprofit trade organization to champion and lead standards and best practices for healthcare resiliency. What is great about both of these organizations is both put the member and the supplier and the partner and the collaborators first. Their main mission, their only mission, is to improve education, awareness, networking, and capabilities building across the industry. So both are uniquely positioned, and the partnership even makes that work even more powerful. Both consist of providers with SMI with 86 and HIRC with 50. Both consist of suppliers, SMI with 56 and HIRC with 20. And both have collaborators with SMI with 15 and HIRC with 12. So both looking at how they engage the full spectrum of the healthcare supply chain and solving these problems together without any ulterior motives, and putting our needs first. So we're excited about this group, very powerful organizations working on the right things together. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about what resilience is, and resilience is really getting, having a degree of supply stream that can be reliable to provide the right products at the right time, at the right place. Also the ability to predict, prevent, and recover from supply chain disruptions. So that's good, makes us not only see it, but also be able to react to it. The drive for preparedness and elasticity and the collaborative risk management of your supply chain or your partner relationships. And lastly, cultivated by partnerships and communication and transparency. We're going to hit on all these today and different elements of how do you assess your resiliency, what tools you can use to leverage and improve your resiliency, and where you sit on the maturity model that SMI has developed, and some of the readiness and standards that HIRC is driving, very complementary in this work. So we're very excited about it, and resilience is the theme. So next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about the overlap. So all are looking at maturity, planning, resiliency, and standards with HIRC and SMI at the center of that. And really there's a lot of synergy as we look at this Venn diagram to make sure that we understand that the collaborative approach to resiliency norms and what we're looking to do. And then we have a more transparent and resilient supply chain. So this was where these two organizations that have providers and suppliers at the table can work end to end versus working in a silo like we've done for over 20 years and not collectively sharing information to benefit all parties in the supply chain from the end-to-end network. So this, again, the right group to work on this, and we're excited about the tools that the next couple of slides are going to walk us through. Next slide, please. So we're going to start out with a polling question. And Nancy, I think you're going to take us away.
Except I do have to unmute, so sorry about that. We do have a couple of polling questions just to get some feedback to help us understand what kind of things folks are working on, and also help you all to understand who's in the audience today. So the first poll we wanted to ask today was, has your organization developed a plan to drive increased resilience? And it's really just a simple question, yes or no, and it's okay if you don't know. I think we're all, trying to find our way in the area of resilience. So if you can take just a moment to enter your response, then we'll show you what the results are for the whole group. I'm seeing some yeses coming through in the chat, which is great. Or if you can see the poll on your screen, you can vote there too. Helen, do we have some results to share? Yes, excellent. We've got a wonderful group here today that's doing some great planning to get ready and create a more resilient supply chain. So 80% of the folks plus more on the chat indicated that they do in fact they have developed a plan to drive increased resilience. Only 6% haven't yet, and we know you're going to get started. And then 14% just aren't sure yet, and that's okay. We're all, as I said, learning as we go, and just hope that today's session will be helpful and give you tools to help continue that planning process. Jesse?
Thanks so much, Nancy. Talon, if you could advance to the next slide. We chose this image of a mountaintop because tackling resiliency is a challenge the size of a mountain. This image seeks to represent a solo climber attempting to go it alone. Resiliency is a team sport and only becomes reality when all sides of the trade relationship are willing to collaborate. For example, the impetus behind HIRC was a firm belief that resiliency cannot be achieved alone. It can only be achieved together. When it comes to resiliency and the patient lives that we serve, there's a key attitude that we must embrace as a healthcare industry. Namely, it's not about what's in it for me, but what's in it for us and what's at stake if we don't. As we go to the next slide, SMI and HIRC have developed a number of resiliency tools to help both providers and suppliers to progress toward greater resilience maturity as a collaborative effort. Nancy, could you start off by summarizing the SMI tool?
Got to unmute again. I sure will, Jesse. SMI was really excited about releasing our SMI Resilience Maturity Model back in June. And so I think a number of you probably on the call have seen it, but it's a maturity model that allows you to score yourself against a number of different elements to identify where you are in the process of getting to a more resilient supply chain and allow you to create plans to advance to further levels of resiliency internally on both the supplier side and the provider side. So we look forward to sharing some details of that with you today.
Thanks, Nancy. And I hope I didn't catch you off guard. I think the prompt belonged on the next slide. So as we progress to slide number 10, let me share with you a little bit about HIRC's tools. Part of HIRC's approach to resiliency is the development of industry standards to create one-to-many scale and efficiency. Each of the HIRC standards shown are driven by our provider and supplier members and supported by industry partners. The Business Continuity Maturity Assessment, or BCM, is a derivative of ISO 22301 and purposed as an external resiliency measurement of your trading partner. The Mapping and Monitoring Framework is a model for how to balance proprietary interests with greater transparency of key nodes of the end-to-end supply chain. The Resiliency Scorecard wraps up the prior two alongside 5 total categories to better identify, measure, and incentivize resilient competencies in your trading partner. In 2023, the HIRC community is taking these initial standards and pushing them to the next evolutionary leap. The BCM assessment will allow for systematic evidence to be provided and a resiliency badge to be earned. Mapping and monitoring will likely involve a new technology option for deep tier mapping and advanced risk and analytics for participating members. And finally, the Resiliency Scorecard will incorporate additional quantitative measures to increase its sophistication. Nancy, could you share any further details about your current work and where you're looking to move in the future?
Yes, Jesse, thank you very much. We've actually just completed a survey of our members to identify where they stand on the resilience maturity model, and we'll be using that at our upcoming forum to do some planning around what the Resilience and Transparency Council will be focusing on in 2023. One of the things we are focused on right now is our criticality framework, not solving the problem of what items are critical, but solving the problem of how do we define the concept of criticality so we can all be speaking the same language and using the same ideas around defining a critical item for our individual organizations. So we're looking forward to releasing that criticality framework by the end of the year. Should we move to the next slide, Jesse? I think we're moving to Amanda. Yes, it's Amanda, right. Amanda Chawla.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Jesse. And I think, before we get into really diving into what we're calling the resiliency maturity model, I would like to provide some background on how this really came to be. So about 1.5 years ago, SMI and SMI members partnered with Professor Rob Hanfield at North Carolina State University on this journey of resiliency and what it really is. As we all know, it's one of the biggest buzzwords of 2021 and has continued in 2022, but we really wanted to understand what this meant and how we, both from a provider and a supplier viewpoint, translated resiliency into action. So what we did is we started off with interviews of supply chain executives and leaders, again, both on the supplier and provider side, to gauge the market and how we all saw resiliency. Then from there, we completed non-healthcare industry specific kind of analysis and research on this topic. And then we went forward and surveyed members in terms of what is now the original formation of what we're calling the Resiliency Maturity Playbook. Just stepping back for a moment, I love that 80% of you here on the call, on the poll answered yes, there is a plan. And this playbook aims to bring alignment on what the resiliency plan is. And as Jesse alluded earlier in his conversation, it's about what's in it for us collectively as an industry and how do we work together to tackle and address this question on resiliency. So the framework and the model is intended to bring a common language where we're all working in unison. And with that, I'd like to transition to the next slide here, in which we're like to introduce the playbook. From what was, again, the interviews and the research, this is what we're calling the 1.0 version of our maturity model and playbook. It serves as a central guide where it provides common definitions and actions for planning. We'll transition into the next slide, which will talk about what it is and what it's not. So let me further describe what the model is. What it is it's intended to provide a framework for both providers and suppliers to speak the same language. It builds on the definition of resiliency, not just being a buzzword, but being something that we truly understand, can assess equally within our organization. It does also provide an emphasis on the need for investment. You can go to your organizations, you can demonstrate the resiliency model, and it talks about very heavily the investments of supply chain. It recommends a percent of criticality, a percent of items that are critical. And as Nancy mentioned, that's the current work under progress. And it's essentially intended to be a leveling model. We'll get into that in just a minute, where level 4 is aspirational. And we no longer define resiliency as resiliency, but we define it as immunity. What is not, it's not going to give you what product is critical and what's not critical. It doesn't go into supplier risk mapping. It doesn't go into individual products. It's not also intended to replace your Office of Emergency or your emergency management playbooks. And it's also not a technology assessment of all the different tools that are out there. Again, it is just intended to be a framework that brings the common definition of resiliency together. So with that, let me transition to the next slide so you can see what we're talking about here. This model, and I know it's intentional where you are unable to read this slide, but if you look on the left-hand side, there's 4 levels of this model. Starting with the foundation is what we'll call level 1, a prepared supply chain organization. Then you get to level 2, where you're responsive, level 3, where you're resilient, and level 4, which we're calling immunity. Again, it's aspirational, it's what we're striving towards. And then on the top-hand side, we have different elements in order of measuring resiliency. We have what's called the what, the scope and services. We have the approach, which is how do we do resiliency? That's where we put community and partnerships, and we have infrastructure and analytics. And over the next couple of slides, between myself and Alan, we'll dive a little bit further into what these means. So if we go into the next slide, we'll talk about the 3 elements at a very, very high level in terms of these are the core buckets that we've identified that you can use to measure your resiliency. So for example, if we look at scope and services, what you don't see here, because it's in the framework of the playbook, is that it's further broken out by these concepts of criticality, risk mitigation, and resources, such as having a dedicated team. And within these 3 sub-elements under the bucket of scope and services, there's clear definitions on what a level 1 versus a level 2, 3, and 4 mean. And Alan will show you this when he gets into the rating scale. So part of this model is for you to assess where you are as an organization, for us as an industry to have a common definition. And third, it's intended for internal use to help drive towards, are we really becoming more resilient? How do we really measure what resiliency is in the organization? So that's really what where the maturity model comes to. Continuing on to the next slide, I'm going to again highlight the 4 different levels that we have. Level 1 is being that prepared supply chain. In essence, what we're saying is if you've scored a level 1, you're in the early stages of your program. You're primarily focused on the response. It is a little bit more reactive, and that's why we have focused so much on response. And Alan will go into how the grading works in just a minute. Level 2 is your responsive supply chain organization. You're focused very heavily on risk mitigation, and you have some insights from your technology, from your reports, from analytics, whether it's AI, demand forecasting. There's some sort of data that's coming in that's helping you become more responsive to the challenges that you're facing. A level 3 supply chain, which we're calling resilient, is very heavily focused on investments. You've done a lot more in the technology area of predictive modeling and responses and business continuity and risk mitigation. And when you reach that level 4, you're truly aspirational. Your collaborative partnerships are transparent. Your risk mitigation program exists, regardless of this concept of critical, somewhat critical, non-critical, but you're truly knocking it out of the ballpark, which is why we're calling it immunity. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to transition and hand off to my colleague, Alan, who will walk you through how you can use this model and measure your own organization.
So, hey, thank you, Amanda. And so I thought what I would do is since Amanda set the framework for the model, the various levels vertically and then horizontally, the different elements, I thought I'd just mention that, you know, if you can't measure it, how do you know where you are? So, you know, how are you going to build greater resiliency if you don't know where you are? So the team came together and we built kind of a simplistic scoring mechanism to allow for measurement across the levels and the elements. You're going to see that the scoring is cumulative as we go across the various elements and will result into a final score. And I wanted to mention too, it's really important to note that as you go through scoring in this model, you might be at a level 2 for maybe scope and service, but a level 1, for prepared under communication and partnerships, and that's completely okay. So you could be at various levels within your organization depending on where you are, and the model intends to show you where you are. So again, let me go through a little bit of the scoring. As you can see, this is scope and service. On the left side, you've got the various levels. And then what we did was assign a points to each level, right? Across criticality, risk mitigation, and dedicated teams for this particular element of scope and service. At the bottom, you'll see you're simply going to add up your totals in those various columns, okay? So that's the first element. Talent, if you go to the next slide, this is communication and partnership. And again, following the same logic of assigning a points to the various levels, again, you will score this page around your communication and partnerships across the various levels and add it up at the bottom. Talent, if you move to the next slide. And then infrastructure and analytics. And again, we assigned scoring that we thought initially made sense in the first version of this model. Of course, it's going to be evolving, predicated on input and feedback that we'll get back from hopefully all of you on the call today. But again, it's going to be cumulative in nature. So for infrastructure and analytics, you'll add up a total at the bottom, and then talent, if you can move to the next slide. This is where we'll all come together in one consolidated score. As you add up sheet 1, 2, and 3, you're going to get a set number of points. And then we put together kind of what we're calling a resiliency maturity level indicator. And you can see, depending on your scoring, if you score 0 to 40 points, that's a good start in your journey to resiliency. 51 to 100 points, you're getting stronger, you're building more resilience, and so forth as you move up in points. The important thing is that you get started in your resiliency journey. You got to start somewhere. You got to understand what your baseline is. As a final note, in terms of the scoring, it's really not important. I wouldn't get caught up in a good or bad score. What's good or bad? It's really, hey, what's my baseline and where do I want to go? And this tool provides the roadmap to see, hey, where are we good? Where are we a little bit weaker? Where are there gaps? What do we need to do? Where do we need to invest within our organization to build more resilience? So that's kind of the scoring mechanism initially for the first version of the model. And we try to make it as simplistic as possible. Again, not grading an A, B, C, D, E in that manner, but just where are you today and where do you want to go? So I think that was it, unless Amanda had anything else you wanted to add to the scoring piece. Otherwise, we'll turn it over to Jesse for the next slide.
Hey, thanks so much, Alan. As previously shared, HIRC is a nonprofit trade association focused on solving for one thing: a more transparent and resilient supply chain. Isn't that something we all want? Isn't that something we all need? Isn't that what our patients deserve? The next few slides will highlight how our values of partnership, communication, and transparency are central to our approach. In this next slide, the process of risk mitigation is not without cost, which means we need to reflect on the impact of strong versus poor resiliency and how this plays a role in sourcing strategy. Our members desire to better identify, measure, and incentivize resilient capabilities and outcomes in their trading partners. The scorecard was piloted with large provider and supplier brands and is now being deployed at an industry level. The scorecard provides a baseline understanding of resiliency attributes, enables consistent measure and incentives for resiliency in trade relationships, and fosters a collaborative approach to understanding resiliency strengths, risks, and proactive mitigation. Next, the scorecard includes 5 categories of resiliency, offers 4 levels of achievement within each, and tallies the points achieved across 4 levels of relationship maturity. The model is customer-driven, collaborative, and includes both quantitative and qualitative elements. Next, please take a look at the scorecard posted to our website at hircstrong.com/engage. It's a one-page tool set with supporting guidance. Categories include geographic footprint and monitoring to support proactive awareness of external threats and natural hazards. Open communication to coordinate prevention and recovery. Business continuity maturity assessment to quantify preparedness. KPI to recognize past performance. And live dialogue to increase a shared awareness of risk and mitigation. Live dialogue is key. A primary goal of the exercise is to increase partnership, communication, and transparency through shared understanding of risk mitigation and discovery of how the trade relationship can further collaborate to reduce risk and increase performance. Now, the second standard is the Business Continuity Maturity, or BCM Assessment, on the next slide. Thank you. BCM is the programmatic structure that organizations use to effectuate resiliency, including the policies and processes to prepare, prevent, and recover from disruptive events. This framework is intended to enable providers to better understand the relative maturity of their trading partner BCM program. The questions are derived from ISO 22301 to quantify resiliency preparedness and help trading partners to plot strengths and growth opportunities. Our goal was to create something light yet meaningful that all of industry could participate in. On the next slide, a brief summary, including that the assessment is 36 questions, takes roughly 1 hour to complete, and rolls up to 5 different levels of maturity. The exercise is a self-assessment derived from an industry gold standard and is growth-oriented, meaning the emphasis is on progress, not perfection. As we move to the next slide, each phase of maturity, starting with initial and ending with collaborative, progresses via stages. Each stage correlates with the reference ISO standard. The content here is a sample of the themes covered. The assessment is open book, including the scoring rubric. The intent is for the supplier to respond in good faith as a precursor for additional dialogue with the provider. To date, nearly 100 strategic suppliers have participated and have shared the results with customers of their choosing directly and confidentially. Now let's move on to the third standard, mapping and monitoring. The premise is that geography matters when it comes to the external threats that face the production and movement of precursors and finished goods along key nodes of the supply chain. Technology can help to estimate risk, monitor for disruption, and create efficiencies in communication. The accompanying worksheet of this standard allows trading partners to calibrate the depth and breadth of transparency pertaining to production, storage, and distribution facilities. Moving to the next slide, the standard is a directional guide that encourages increased transparency for more strategic relationships and/or goods and service. As such, transparency can be measured in 3 dimensions, including depth of mapping tier, scope of product, and the specificity of each. The entire exercise is confidential, tailored to what matters, and designed to maximize value and reduce noise. For example, by focusing on event alerts that truly matter. Moving forward to the next. In brief, this graphic seeks to represent the directionality just discussed. As the importance of the trade relationship on the left increases, and the importance of the good or service increases on the right, then the transparency variables in the center should move in proportion. In a nutshell, that's the essence of the standard, and it's deployed by a secure and confidential supporting platform. For my final slide, as we advance, HIRC is a community of providers, suppliers, and industry partners. And it looks like maybe my final slide is not here. So I will continue anyhow. HIRC is you, HIRC is us. We're a community led by providers and suppliers just like you. And I'd like to take a moment for Tom, Amanda, and Alan, each of which serve on the HIRC Board of Directors, to share their thoughts on the following question. So first you, Tom, why has your organization chosen to engage in HIRC and its standards for resiliency?
Simply put, this is something that we cannot do on our own. We have to do this as a collective industry with partners, with providers, with suppliers at the table. This cannot be done in the traditional silo of what providers do on their side or suppliers do on their work. But together, we'll look at the end-to-end supply chain, develop things that are scalable, usable, and repeatable, and be actually able to change the industry for the good that we need to do versus trying to do it in a fragmented way that only creates confusion, inefficiency, and unreliable outcomes.
Really appreciate that, Tom. And Tom is our chair-elect and will be leading our community next year. Amanda, Stanford is also represented on the board of directors of HIRC. Will you share briefly, why did you choose to be a part of the HIRC community and what do the standards mean to you?
Yeah, Jesse, excellent question. I don't think I can articulate it any better than Tom. I think it's really about the collective industry coming together, and there's no one organization that can do this alone. And so really what HIRC offers is it provides that sense of community. It provides the standards, and we're developing the standards together. We're shaping the way that we really ought to work and need to work as an industry. And that ability to influence, that ability to become more resilient is stronger together. It goes back to the comment that Tom made about fragmentation. And what I love about HIRC and what I appreciate about HIRC is it's a very focused, very mission-based and centered around that collaboration, that trade association, that integration and interface.
Truly appreciate that, Amanda. And Alan, you're one of 3 suppliers representing industry on the board of directors of HIRC. Can you share why did Baxter choose to be a member of HIRC, much less a board member of HIRC, and what do the standards mean to you?
Sure. And Jesse, and I'd like to say ditto to Tom and Amanda, everything they just said. But I think, for me, in representing the supplier community, standards, I want to underscore standards because we are being asked from providers or others for all this information, whether it's scorecarding, mapping, upstream supplier data, and there are no standards. And so we get asked many, many, many different ways to supply very similar information. So we as an organization can land on these standards and these tools. I think that's going to create efficiencies. It's going to get the providers the information they want. It's going to help the suppliers as much on the supplier side to really kind of lock arms as an industry around these tools and these standards to create efficiencies for everybody. So that's why I'm excited about it, and being part of HIRC and SMI is allowing us to build towards that goal and that vision. So thank you, Jesse.
Hey, really appreciate that, Alan. And now handing off to Tom to lead us into the next segment.
Certainly. So a lot of what we talked about today is why these 2 great organizations are working together. And SMI is leading the way on building resiliency maturity models, which really translates well then into the HIRC tools of once you know your maturity model level, then you can use the Resiliency Scorecard, the business continuity management and assessment, and the mapping and monitoring to continue to move up that maturity model. So very well nested and collaborative in their work. And again, it's a great example of all of us what we need to do together to work on these challenges, work on them in a logical, standard-based approach to have results and make them scalable and efficient for everyone that's in the continuum trying to make our work better. So what's next for SMI? SMI is defining criticality. We'll be working on what elements to measure, how we'll get the information, and who are the stakeholders. So really defining how we're going to define criticality, and then how we pass information between people to actually act on that. What's next for HIRC? HIRC is coming up as we're really focused on execution, of our standards and our 101 work. And then for moving into planning to start driving awareness, accelerate adoption, resiliency badging certification, and many more information exchanges. So really very parallel to the work that we're trying to do. And that's why this group is working so well together. And we ask that you support this work, jump on the bandwagon, the more the better as we continue to drive this work forward. Next slide, please. So we're going to have a lot of time left here at the end, a lot more than we thought. So we're going to have about 20 minutes left when we're done. So we're asking to start putting your questions in now. So please start to submit questions if you have any, and we will do our best to get to all of them if there are too many. But we would like to start seeing some questions entered in. So as we wrap up the last couple slides, we will be prepared to move into the questions. So our next polling question will be, will you use the tools you have seen today to drive increased resilience for your organization in the next 90 days? So will you be taking action from what you learned today in the next 90 days? We'll have a couple more seconds on our poll, and we'll continue to get those results back. Awesome. So we have 59% that said yes, we have 25% that said maybe, and we have 16% that don't know. So we'd love to see more yeses, because all of us together will change the industry. But we are very pleased with the results of that survey. So thank you for participating, and thank you for making a commitment to start implementing these standards and driving the industry changes that we need. Next slide. So the journey for HIRC and SMI as we go through this is to join us on this journey to being more resilient. So we have access to the websites. You can go to the HIRC Strong website. You can go to the SMI website. All of those tools are available at no cost. To access those tools, read them, share them with your teams, start to put project plans and work and assessment work together, figure where you're at, and then driving, accelerate, adopt, and making everyone aware. So those are the things that we are asking for you to contribute as you leave this webinar, to help us accelerate the change by going out and downloading those standards and that information and the maturity model, adopt them yourself, and then make others aware through other venues that you have to do that. So I believe that will be wrapping up, and we would love to see questions. We're going to remind everyone to do the survey as well that's in the link, and we want to make sure we thank everyone as we go into the questions for the next 20 or so minutes. So do we have, Nancy, do we have any questions up?
There's kind of a fun question, Tom, that I'm going to take. And the first question I noticed is there a merger in your future? Meaning, I'm assuming HIRC and SMI. And the answer is no. But SMI and HIRC are both strongly committed to collaborating across the industry. And so that's what you're seeing today is the SMI and HIRC collaboration. We want to make sure that we are not doing things that interfere with each other or that use resources in duplicate ways, but that we're doing complementary work. So we will continue to collaborate closely with HIRC, as we have with a number of other sister organizations throughout SMI's history, and we see that collaboration and partnership continuing to drive value for all of us. So thanks for that question. The next question we have is, has SMI and HIRC considered developing a product level resiliency assessment tool for the most critical products and items? Amanda, I know that's something we've talked about a lot in our Resiliency and Transparency Council. So I'll let you kind of take that first and maybe hand it off to some others.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So we have talked about criticality, and the criticality part of the conversation is what products are critical or not critical, or somewhat critical. And what we've talked about is doing a framework instead of going in and saying, for example, a 4x4 is critical or a butterfly is not critical. Instead of getting at that level of granularity, instead what we need to do from an SMI standpoint is build a framework so each organization can then use that framework of going into criticality. And the best example that I can give as an analogy is safety events. So in the healthcare space, we have serious safety events, we have an adverse event, we have a sentinel event, we have a near miss. There's a rating scale essentially. And so that is really the criticality framework that we have started. We had our initial conversations, I want to say a quarter or so ago, and at the last SMI spring meeting in this October, we're actually going to be further delving into that. And that conversation is really about developing that criticality framework for both suppliers and providers. So we have a common definition and we have a common framework, which then organizations can use. We've talked about, is it all medical supplies? Is it all supplies? What about pharmaceutical? Things of that sort. Those are all the different questions that we're taking into consideration in the criticality framework. And as of right now, our approach is to be very, very broad and inclusive and allow for individual organization customization. Excellent question.
Anything to add, Jesse or Alan or Tom? Great.
Amanda nailed it. She nailed it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions around investment and the need to invest in resiliency. How do you make a business case? How do you quantify the benefits? And what kind of investments do you think providers, especially, but both providers and suppliers need to make in order to drive improved resiliency? Alan, do you want to start on that one?
Sure. I mean, because it always comes down to a money thing at some point, right? To build resiliency. So maybe I'll make a comment or two around kind of a supplier's perspective, and I'll speak for my own organization. I mean, we know it's the right thing to do, right? To take care of our collective patients. If you don't have a product, you can't deliver therapy, but there is a cost associated with that. So, from a supplier perspective, maybe that's built back into the contracting process of, for example, you're always going to want, if you're a provider, competitive price or deal per se, but maybe, from a supplier standpoint, we want consistency, we want the long-term arrangement. So maybe we get awarded a longer-term contract, which would help, justify building resiliency in the portfolios and products that are deemed critical that we know providers need and want every day. So maybe it's a longer-term contract, maybe it's a partnership between the organizations that can be created that are mutually beneficial, and deliveries and efficiencies that can be done that way to kind of build the business case for any given organization. That would be my initial thought, Nancy.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I think there's a couple additional things that we're doing, at least in our organization. And that doesn't mean they're the right ones. They're the ones we're doing. We're holding more inventory when we don't have information. So we are exchanging information for inventory. We have hired inventory planners. I would love to continue to add that team to include demand planners. So we're adding capabilities. And then we're talking to suppliers around where we can collectively share information more effectively and work together to solve some of the problems on the end-to-end supply chain and in a partnership fashion. None of that is easy. A lot of that's time consuming. We have a lot of resources that we have dedicated to supply disruptions. So our goal is to slowly transition many of those roles over into resiliency roles as the supply chain stables and we get more proactive and get less reactive in the work that we're doing. So hopefully it'll be a combination of new resources and potentially some repurposed resources as we get some of the inefficiencies out of it.
I'd like to just add a little bit to what Tom says. In addition to inventory, human capital resources, there's also reporting and analytic resources. and ensuring or helping your supply chain become more intelligent with the data that you have and having meaningful data. So that's another area of investment. But I believe the second part of the question was how do you really measure the ROI? And to be quite honest, it's difficult. So one way that Stanford is measuring the ROI is we look at our fill rates of inventory coming in from our suppliers, and then we also measure our fill rate to the bin location at the par point. And that's one way in which we have demonstrated to our organization, both our clinical partners and our executive, the ROI of investing in resiliency is supply reliability. So if we're getting, for example, 80% fill rate, our fill rate to the unit may be 98%, 99%. So that gap is what our resiliency team covers. That's one way to measure it. The second element that we're looking at is how we measure our inventory and performance around that versus just in time versus what we're calling our strategic stockpiling. Not necessarily just in case, but getting into just in time. So we've got some metrics around that and presenting that ROI to the organization. But I think that's an important part of the conversation that you have to have within your organization. This work is not going to happen just because we're running supply chain. It requires an active investment. And the resiliency playbook and model actually speaks to the requirement of an investment. So if you're struggling as an organization to get those resources, one thing that you may be able to leverage is that playbook from an industry standpoint.
Great. Another question relative to confidentiality and understanding that the HIRC discussions seem to have a confidentiality as a core concept. Alan, specifically as a supplier, how does the confidentiality component of HIRC help you with the consistency of information requests and data standards? Is the confidentiality an important part of sort of providing this information to help us with transparency and resilience?
Yeah. It is from an organizational perspective, because then it builds that information sharing that I think needs to go both ways, much more than if the confidentiality wasn't there. In some of the tools, I mean, it's very open book. I think most organizations would be comfortable sharing a lot of it, but as you get further upstream or the questions become more inherent to an organization where you may have, competitive concerns or trade concerns, the fact that it's confidential, you can control the information and who you share it with, I think is really, really important. I know the tools were built, many of them with that flexibility in order to give both sides that comfort level with sharing.
Great. Jesse, any other comments, or did Alan kind of capture it?
Well, I think I'll take this opportunity to pull on a different question that I don't think we've covered yet in the chat, which is a question about the cost of resiliency. And personally, I've not seen a quantitative assessment from anyone in industry at this point, whether for-profit, nonprofit, provider, or supplier, or partner. So I would love to see that if someone has an example of that. But at face value, prevention and recovery, whether pre or post disruption, clearly have an economic cost as well as missional and brand. And so I think the ROI is really difficult to capture from an accounting perspective, which is why, for example, on the provider side, it can be difficult to secure incremental resources to build a resiliency program. So there has to be a bit of faith that a lack of resiliency is bad for business. It's bad for the end service to the patient that's being served. And so there has to be a semi-quantitative valuation that those types of resources and those types of investments are absolutely necessary. And I would suggest most, if not all, of the members of both HIRC and SMI would tend to align with these are investments worth making. And that's why we're coming together. And certainly within the HIRC community, that is the belief. And if there's anyone out there that feels that they have the particular data or the particular skills to do a white paper approach on this, I would love to connect with you. If not, I hope that the public good and the patient-centric need, as well as the business necessity of being a faithful partner and fulfilling the orders that your customer has requested, is motivation enough to make balanced investments, knowing that there still has to be a margin in order to continue to serve.
Thanks, Jesse. That was a great great catch to an important question. There's a question, Tom, that's specifically directed at you. And the question is, as a large IDN in the Midwest, are you utilizing these tools at BJC? And if so, how are they impacting your work?
A resounding yes, we are. We have, our leadership team has gone through the SMI assessment tool. I wish we were higher than we scored ourselves. And we are taking those results and building our 3-year plan on how we're going to continue to march toward level 3 and level 4 in the maturity model. And we're utilizing the HIRC tools to achieve much of that work. So yes, we are absolutely using the assessment to figure out where we're at, what our priorities need to be. And then we're utilizing the ready-made tools that just pull off the shelf and run with that HIRC has delivered to make our work easier.
Wonderful. And Amanda, same for Stanford?
Likewise, yep, exactly what Tom's doing. We're also using the SMI tool. And like Tom, we wish we were much higher, but we are where we are. And I think that's important to understand, that this is not you comparing yourself to another organization. This is you comparing your own self over time and saying, are you really becoming resilient, and having some level of clear criteria around that. So that's what we're definitely using.
Wonderful. Here's another question, I think, for everyone, but specifically, Alan, you might want to address this. The question is as follows. I want to read the beginning because I think it'll all resonate with all of us. The providers are exhausted with this disrupted environment, and we are reliant on our tier 1 suppliers to get this right. Interested in how Baxter is using these tools with their suppliers, and how are they making that work visible to their customers? So just wondering if you're using these tools kind of going back up in your own supply chain, or if right now it's really just between the provider and the manufacturer distributor.
Yeah, so I would answer yes to some degree in terms of how we can get more upstream and be more proactive with our supplier community and build resiliency and redundancy, where, you know, we use the tools to identify gaps and then try to build more redundancy within our portfolio. You know, where you might have had a supplier of resin, for example, in the past for a particular product, you know, can we get 2 or 3? Might not make sense to do that for every product, but for those that are deemed critical, that are high volume, high moving items, we are doing that. And then how do we get more proactive for the provider community as well, to give more signaling, you know, to where, if we're going to run into problems or where we might have some resiliency gaps, so the providers can be more planful as well. So we are using the tools, definitely. They're great internal conversations, and identifying, you know, you asked about Baxter. I mean, we have a long way to go. I think we've got more resilient since Maria back in 2017. And again, we just had another hurricane in Puerto Rico. Hopefully the provider community won't really feel that whatsoever because of the resilience that we built into the model for those plants that are impacted. But we are using the tools. They're not just provider centric. You know, everything we discussed today, a supplier can absolutely use these to get higher upstream, build more resiliency in our own organizations, which will better serve the provider community as an end result. So definitely endorsing this on the supplier side as well, these tools to be used. Yep.
Thank you. Here's a question that I think we didn't really address, but I think I know the answer from all of you. And Jesse, I'll start with you. Can you speak to the role that you see data standards playing in resiliency?
Yeah, absolutely. So if this is about good ID, I'd have to defer to a group like HIMSS, who seem to be much more attuned to this topic. What I would suggest is that we absolutely need to get more congruent on how we define, measure, and incentivize resiliency. It's a very squishy word. It's aspirational by its nature. And I think the tools that have been presented today help to bring a little bit more science, alignment, and scalability to the topic. When it comes to item master, I don't have particular insight on that. And I believe by and large, it's a bit outside of what HIRC is looking to accomplish. We're looking to paint more with broad brushes and medium brushes. And then when there's a particular tactical or operational niche that needs to be deployed, That's where those precision brushes can come into play.
I'll jump in and add to the conversation. Jesse really focused on, rightly so, what HIRC is doing to develop the framework for how we're going to convey information to each other. Data standards are critical for when that transmission of data starts to happen, that we're speaking a common language. If we do not have a common language, when we start sending demand forecasts or recall notices and all the things that go back and forth between our organizations, if we are not using data standards, it will be messy, it won't be clear. We're going to have to hire a lot of people to work through the data. Data standards is a foundational step that every organization, you don't need HIRC, and you don't need, like Jesse said, you don't need SMI to do that. That's just work that we need to do back at home.
And let me just add one more perspective. I couldn't agree more with what was just stated. It is built in terms of the requirement and the concept of data standards in the playbook, in terms of it is part of the foundation of building that right-hand side of maturity in terms of resiliency. So it is part of the framework it's a recognition as a requirement to becoming even more immune as an immune supply chain organization.
Wonderful, thank you. One other quick question. I think I'll just do a round robin and ask everyone to answer quickly, but we've got a question. Can we safely assume that SMI and HIRC will dive deeper during the next year into the how-to elements of building out our resiliency program? Amanda?
Of course, we're starting that criticality, or we're actually doing a deep dive 3 weeks from now.
Alan?
Absolutely. The hard part is, there's so much there that you could work on. You really got to focus in on what you do want to accomplish. And in 2023, I think we've got a good roadmap, Amanda and Nancy, what we'd like to work on. Yeah.
Jesse, what about from the HIRC perspective?
Nancy, will you do me a favor? I was enjoying some of the chat. Will you repeat briefly?
Yes, we're just trying to understand, will we dive, because SMI will, and I know HIRC will, but you might want to give a little insight. Will you dive deeper in the next year into the how-to elements of building out the resiliency program? Not just sort of the concepts, but dive deeper into specific how-tos.
Yeah, certainly. So the lanes that HIRC is currently driving in to effectuate a more transparent and resilient supply chain for everyone at an industry level involves the 3 tools that we discussed today: the scorecard, the business continuity maturity assessment, and mapping and monitoring. Certainly those aren't the only 3 tools that are needed, but for the sake of time, that's what we focused on. And moving into the next year, we're going to take each of those deeper. So each of these tools is posted to our website, have how-to and have guidance with them and supporting FAQ. The way in which we're going to go deeper, for example, with the scorecard, is what additional quantitative elements belong in a balanced scorecard. And additionally, can we explore a bi-directional venue wherein suppliers can provide feedback to customers? Is there something that the customer could offer, maybe some sort of demand signal that would help service levels to be more consistent? So that's part 1. Part 2 on the assessment, there was a really good chat question from Stefan with risks. RISC is another nonprofit that HIRC's in conversation with that may allow for a very sophisticated, repeatable, quantitative method of measuring resiliency programmatically, not only at the supplier level, but also at the product level. So I think that's very compelling and something that HIRC is looking to explore in the coming year. And then lastly, from a mapping and monitoring perspective, I think one of the most difficult portions of this is what role does geographic insight play? It's not nothing, it's not everything, it's something in between. And the danger is that sometimes more data is worse than less data. What really matters is insight. Data is worthless if you don't have insight. And so HIRC is going to continue to work with existing technology partners and exploring new relationships to drive more toward insights. And I think that would be the best that I can share to that question at this time.
Thank you, Jesse. And I think we're at the top of the hour. Tom, I'm going to let you finish us out today.
Sure. So I'm going to answer the question. Yes, but you need to help. Everyone needs to help with this. If you're part of SMI, if you're part of HIRC, you need to get and help us do this work. 2, you need to adopt the standards and adopt the work, because it's not any good on a piece of paper sitting somewhere. So we need to adopt it, make it the standard. We'll change the marketplace. And 3, don't go out doing your own thing. You're going to create a lot of noise in the marketplace. Work together as a collaborative. We need to make this change together. And then I would like to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you for all of you for participating. We really enjoyed our time today. Wishing each and every one of you a wonderful healthcare supply chain week next week. Hope you have a wonderful time celebrating with your teams. We thank you for all that you do. Join us in this work. It's important work. We can't let the things of the last couple of years go unchanged. We have to make positive change in the industry, and this is the team to do it. Thank you for being here.